Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Thursday, July 21st. I am away from the actual computer at the moment. I'm recording this for you ahead of time. I thought I might run through a couple of articles, maybe do an abbreviated session today, just to keep you up to date on some things. I know it's an exciting day. Today, later on, prime time, 8 p.m., of course, the big season finale of the January 6th committee's first round of hearings, which I anticipate should be awfully interesting. Of course, they're trying to put on the big show. And we, of course, will review what's going on tomorrow when we come back, Friday. We'll be back on the air live for that. So I don't expect we'll have to miss a beat on that. But it being Thursday, it kind of felt like there was a hole in the middle of the week. And there would be. And I just ran a rerun last week. You know how I feel about these things. I feel like I'm leaving it in the lurch with nothing to listen to on a Thursday. That can be especially deadly, I think. I don't know. There's nothing wrong with doing it on a Thursday. And, I considered it, believe me. But, I feel a certain loyalty to you, and I know you'd like to have something fresh. Even though, as it turns out, I get some good comments on some of these reruns, too. People rediscover stories they forgot. Anyway, I thought I'd squeeze in a couple of things. And I had some more non-political pieces that I was thinking about using, but they didn't run all that long, as it turns out. So I thought that maybe I would start with a look back at what writing was available yesterday, but I did not read it because we were squeezing in too many other stories, but about the election results in Maryland. And I think it's mostly, do I have anything other than Maryland? Actually just concentrating on Maryland as it happens, where they really outdid themselves in terms of nominating right-wing wackadoodles. And we made mention of the fact that was the case. We talked about the fact that there are some who believe that there were Democrats meddling in the primary to try and help, quote-unquote, help the Republicans nominate someone who would be so crazy that it just might work, beating them in November. But we know that's not a particularly good strategy. Plus, we know it's very unlikely that there were enough Democrats doing anything like that. And, of course, it excuses Republicans for responsibility for nominating these people in the first place, when we know very well that the base of the Republican Party wants very much to nominate these people. And why absolve them of the guilt of having done so? I don't know. Well, those things will be worked out in the days to come. In the meantime, there is some writing to share on who's who in Republican nominees in Maryland. And, of course, we mentioned yesterday that one of the candidates for Senate, and I didn't check up to see how that Senate race went, and I guess I ought to do that. But the Maryland Republicans had a wacko on their hands there. The guy who was like running under a totally different name, a fake name, I guess. I would love for it. There was no explanation for having the two completely different names that I saw yesterday. Maybe I can look that up while we're working on this. Anyway, at the gubernatorial level, which I love that word, and in the race for Attorney General, it turns out they've done the same thing in the Republican Party in Maryland and nominated true weirdos and off-the-rails right-wing idiots. So I thought I'd share some of the writing on it. Let's see. I'll begin with Vice News, which has a write-up by Cameron Joseph on the gubernatorial nominee, being at the head of the ticket there. And their review, and then we'll move on to the Attorney General, who I have a couple of things about. We usually don't hear quite as much about them, but usually you don't see these weirdos nominated in tandem. It's one or two per state, and Maryland's got 3 going. Well, 2 nominated, and I don't know what happened in the Senate. Anyway, they're not fooling around in the headline over advice. The GOP, the GOP, as I like to say, just nominated a, quote, QAnon whack job. and a true Confederate in Maryland. Well, they weren't even in the Confederacy. But this guy makes a big deal about that and apparently laments the fact that they weren't in the Confederacy. All right. Well, at any rate, I think the true Confederate person, that might be the AG. Anyway, subheader here reads, a guy who tried to impeach Maryland's GOP governor was just nominated to replace him. And he's not even the most extreme candidate who won on Tuesday. Oh, boy. A man who organized buses to Washington on January 6th, and let me just say, it's no huge feat to organize a bus to Washington from Maryland. I don't even know if that counts as organizing, but okay. A man who organized buses to Washington on January 6th tweeted during the Capitol riot that Vice President Mike Pence was a, quote, traitor, tried to impeach Maryland Republican Governor Larry Hogan over his actions to stem COVID-19, and spoke at a QAnon conference this spring, just won the Republican nomination for Maryland governor. And he's not even the most extreme candidate Maryland Republicans nominated for statewide office on Tuesday. Maryland State Delegate Dan Cox won the GOP gubernatorial primary Tuesday night, buoyed by an endorsement from former President Donald Trump and big spending Democrats. I guess here is maybe the only place that you could even begin to actually lay blame at the feet of Democrats for this nomination. I did hear about this after the show, and we'll see what they mention in the article, and if not, we'll have to fill in the blanks. But as we said, buoyed not only by an endorsement from Trump, but big spending by Democrats. And his coattails helped his friend and ally, Michael Peroutka. I hope I'm not pronouncing that correctly, but that's how it's spelled. Peroutka, Peroutka. I can't even say the letters involved. It's that weird looking. Michael Peroutka, a Christian nationalist and former board member of the Neo-Confederate Secessionist League of the South, whose extreme views are almost too numerous to enumerate, helped him win the GOP's nomination for Attorney General. Their wins show how radicalized and conspiracy theory-minded a significant segment of the Republican base has grown in response to COVID and Trump's lies about the 2020 election, even in a Democratic-leaning state like Maryland. The Associated Press has called both races. Peroutka led his race by 58% to 42%, with an estimated 78% of the ballots counted, while Cox led his primary by 56% to 40%, with an estimated 80% of ballots counted in that race as of Wednesday morning. Those margins may narrow, as mail-in ballots won't be counted until Thursday, today. But the AP assessed that there aren't enough outstanding ballots to make up the difference. And those ballots, believe me, they are outstanding. They're absolutely the best ballots you ever saw in your life. Cox's win comes after a vocal endorsement from Trump. That's the only way he does endorsements. He doesn't write them. I might tweet them or put them on Truth Social. But a vocal, they mean, of course, outspoken endorsement from Trump. He's a really terrific guy. Beautiful, beautiful gentleman. I don't know what he said about him. Anyway, his long-running feud with Hogan, that is Trump's feud with Hogan, helped sink Hogan's hand-picked successor, former Maryland Commerce Secretary Kelly Schultz, and sink her in the primary. Cox also benefited from millions in campaign ads. Here's the problem. Millions in campaign ads from Democrats highlighting his ties to Trump in a successful bid to help him win the primary so they'd face a significantly less electable candidate in the general election. I didn't see the ads. I don't know what they were doing. I don't know if I understand them to be fake good for him, or whether they thought tying him to Trump would be viewed perhaps as positive among Trump voters, but was really tongue-in-cheek or outright negative for the rest of everybody who was watching. I really don't know what they were doing, but I didn't love the sound of that, I must admit. Peroutka has repeatedly said he believes public education is a communist plot and during his campaign argued that Maryland laws protecting both gay marriage and abortion are illegal and unconstitutional because they violate God's law. Okay. He called the Confederate song Dixie the national anthem and is a former board member of the League of the South, a neo-Confederate organization whose explicit aim is for the South to leave the U.S. and form its own country. That organization is best known for helping to organize the 2017 Charlottesville Unite the Right white supremacist rally that turned violent, deadly in fact, a few years after Perutka left the group. So I guess he's disclaiming responsibility for that. Perutka doesn't like the term neo-Confederate, but it's the neo part he takes issue with. In 2014, he called the term a code word that's meant to stir up hatred against us, although Confederate will do just the same, if you ask me. If anything, I just want to be a true Confederate. Well, okay, that stirs up hatred against you. From me. Anyway, if anything, I just want to be a true Confederate, Perutka said, according to Right Wing Watch. Neither candidate has a real shot of winning the general election in Democratic-leaning Maryland, I hope. Hogan called Cox a QAnon whack job last November, one of the nicer things he's had to say about Cox during the campaign. But remember, again, we are talking about this is what the current Republican governor of Maryland has to say about this guy. I stress that not because, even a Republican says this guy's a right-wing nut job, but rather because Maryland has a Republican governor. All right? So it's true that it's more likely that moderates who would swing toward voting for a Republican for governor in a Democratic-leaning state like Maryland would prefer only seemingly moderate candidates. But Larry Hogan, like most Republicans, while he's moderate for a Republican, is still pretty right-wing. And again, they're just finishing up the consequences of having elected a Republican governor in this Democratic-leaning state. So I don't love the gambit. I'll tell you that right now. Okay. Anyway, so he's on the record calling him a QAnon whack job, and that's good. Cox has, of course, tweeted using the hashtag WWG1WGA. It sounds pretty dumb when you read it that way, but it's a reference, of course, to the QAnon slogan, where we go one, we go all. But I love that they use the number one instead of just O for O-N-E, one. But whatever. It doesn't spell anything, so that's kind of internet-y and fun, I'm sure, to them. Neither of these guys has a shot in hell of winning the general election in Maryland. It's mathematically impossible, Schultz and Hogan advisor Doug Meyer recently told Vice News. But that guy is a Republican consultant, and he was just wrong about the race that he just lost, so I'm a little worried about him being wrong about the other race, too. Anyway, we know he doesn't want them to win. It's not even clear, by the way, that their GOP primary opponents will endorse them. Schultz hasn't said what she'll do. Well, okay. I mean, shouldn't that be obvious if they're QAnon nut jobs and wackadoodles and they have no shot in hell? Like, there's no downside to not endorsing someone who hasn't got a shot in hell in terms of reprisals from that person. I guess other Republicans could take it out on you, but I don't know if I'm buying into the no shot in hell thing if the reaction isn't instantaneous. No, there's no way I will endorse that person if they win the primary. But okay, so Schultz hasn't said what she'll do, while Hogan's team said Wednesday morning that he wouldn't vote for Cox. All right, that's not an endorsement certainly, but okay. I mean, that's what you need to say, I guess. All right, fine. Jim Shallek. It's probably not shellac, but Shallek, S-H-A-L-L-E-C-K, the establishment-leaning candidate Perutka defeated on Tuesday, recently told Vice News that he wasn't sure who he'd vote for this November. That's a very tough decision for me to make, knowing what his history is, Shallek said. His background concerns me very much. Well, okay. That's about as much as you're likely to get out of up-and-comers. Hogan probably figures his career is pretty much done. He probably has no designs for running for president, except possibly, or even for Senate. I guess we should throw that out there too. The other likely path away from the governorship following a term there. Most politicians will either make the step towards running for Senate or president. And I guess his name has been mentioned in the past. But even so, what I mean is he has no intention of running for higher office unless in the lane of the never Trumpers. You know what I mean? Where if that's not enough to get him nominated, fine with him. He's perfectly happy not being nominated. He'll take a real shot at it. But anyway, I think we get the idea that he's not willing to sell out on his never Trumpism in exchange for the office. And I guess that's a good thing. That's the only thing keeping him moderate. So I have another set piece here, a published story this time on Michael Peroutka, this time over at HuffPost. Michael Peroutka, neo-Confederate activist, wins GOP race for Maryland Attorney General. Peroutka is a Christian nationalist extremist, that's twice he's been called on the show already today, who has refused to disavow a white supremacist group to which he once belonged. We know which one that is. Christopher Matthias, writing this piece for HuffPost. Michael Peroutka, a neo-Confederate activist who's refused to disavow a racist group to which he once belonged, has won the Republican nomination to be Maryland's next Attorney General. Peroutka, a former Anne Arundel County Council member, beat his opponent, Jim Shalick, a former state and federal prosecutor, on Tuesday. He'll face Democrat Anthony Brown in November. Even among the various far-right candidates the Republican Party has nominated across the country, Peroutka stands out for his extremism. It's weird that, they can even produce such people out of Maryland, but there it is. Holding views that would be alarming for anyone seeking public office, let alone someone vying to be a state's top law enforcement official. Don't forget that. As documented in a recent extensive Vice News profile, I don't think I even saw that. I mean, it was just over at Vice News, but I didn't see that profile of him. Well, it's Cameron Joseph again, so I assume he made all the points he wanted to make in his roundup. And we'll continue on with the HuffPost. So as documented in this other Vice News profile, Peroutka is part of a growing Christian nationalist coalition that's tightening its grip on the GOP. He believes lawmakers should, quote, take a biblical worldview and apply it to civil law and government. No, I believe he should not. In practice, this means Peroutka would refuse to accept Maryland's law protecting the right to an abortion. Don't forget about that. He has also said he'd refuse to accept a Supreme Court ruling that protects same-sex marriage. That's not law. This is a quote. That's not law. It can't be law because it violates God's law, he said at an event this month. Well, it doesn't, and it is law. So sorry, you're completely wrong about that. But I kind of like the thinking. It helps validate my own thinking about so-called constitutional sheriffs who say they also won't enforce these laws, which is to say, my thinking, that is these people aren't law enforcement officers. They're just kooks who mistakenly got badges, and they're not law enforcement officers because they're certainly not enforcing the law, so they can't be. Except I'm right. I know how bad this sounds. I'm right and they're wrong. But the books say that this is the law. These are law books here, and we've printed these laws in these books because they are the laws. That can't be a law. Well, it is. Look, it's in the book. That's the way it goes. Sorry, you're just wrong about that. All right. In a 2014 blog post, Peroutka described the separation of church and state as, quote, the great lie, before we had moved on to the terminology of the big lie, of course. That same year, he argued for dismantling public education, which he denounced as the 10th plank in the Communist Manifesto, which I don't think he's actually wrong about. I don't know whether it's the 10th plank necessarily, but it is true that free public education, I think, made its first appearance in a published, political document in the Communist Manifesto. That's true. But we're kind of, used to it here now, and it kind of got proposed, and there's nothing particularly communist about the way it works, but, they had an idea to do it from a communist point of view, and we implemented it from a social democratic, perhaps socialist point of view, which is admittedly a little bit different. At any rate, okay, so it's the 10th plank of the Communist Manifesto, he says. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. But there's no convincing him of that, and I wouldn't expect to. And in 2002, we're going back to 2002 now, according to Vice, Peroutka gave a speech to a racist organization called the League of the South, in which he said he was, quote, still angry. That's interesting. Still angry that Maryland did not secede from the Union during the Civil War. Although I do think that they thought about doing that, and then they were pretty quickly occupied by federal troops, because otherwise Washington, D.C. would have been cut off from the North, the rest of the actual Union, and it was just an implausible situation, and so I guess they flooded the zone there with troops. It is interesting, though, the dynamics, because a lot of Maryland is pretty southern, and Eastern Shore Maryland, where they had plantations, I guess, might have been inclined to go that way. But at the same time, there's Civil War lore about remaining in the Union, the Barbara Ritchie story, etc. But anyway, he's still angry, even though the decision not to leave the Union and the entire outcome of the Civil War all resolved itself 100 years before he was born. So, I don't know whether really he can say still angry, but that's the language you use to sell yourself at a League of the South meeting, I guess. Peroutka served on the board of the League of the South, which believes that today's southern states should secede from the U.S., and he was on the board from 2012 to 2014. Not as long ago as 2002 there, so that's more recent. Once at a group conference in 2012, Peroutka sang Dixie, which I imagine they all do, a song with origins in minstrel performances that was the anthem of the Confederacy during the Civil War. That same year, Michael Hill, president of the League of the South, wrote that the cold facts of history tell us that blacks have never created anything approximating a civilization in the Western sense of the term. Of course, you might say, well, except for the one that we're living in now, but that these guys think white guys did. Anyway, Hill has previously written that the League of the South supported a return to a political and social system based on kith and kin rather than an impersonal state wedded to the idea of the universal rights of man. At its core is a European population, which, by the way, the current European population has actually migrated much more to the impersonal state wedded to the ideas of the universal rights of man. Just for the record. But okay, so he's an Amish Confederate. That's what it is. He just doesn't recognize progress since the 1800s. Peroutka left the organization in 2014 when he ran for his county council seat, citing disagreements with Hill over his views against interracial marriage. Oh, interesting. Still, as Vice notes, Peroutka has refused to disavow the League of the South even after Hill pledged in 2016 to be a white supremacist, a racist, an anti-Semite. Why does that have to happen? Now, come on. A homophobe, a xenophobe, an Islamophobe. There's a lot of phobia involved in the Confederacy. And any other sort of phobe that benefits my people, so help me God. That doesn't sound like a real oath, though. And even after the group's involvement in the deadly 2017 white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, Peroutka, I guess, has refused to disavow them. Indeed, Peroutka wouldn't even denounce the group during his latest bid for Maryland Attorney General, which he has won the nomination for, and so that's where we land. Now, there is at least one more item to share about this. Let's see. And that is a thread from Sarah Posner. Sarah Posner, the check-marked personage of Twitter fame, has been name-checked on the show several times, has this thread reading, "The projected victories of two far-right GOP candidates in the Maryland primary for governor and attorney general provides a potent opportunity to show how the long game of Christian nationalism intersects with the insurrection and election denialism." How's that for a thread? Let's read it. First, for background, yesterday the Trump-endorsed candidate for the GOP gubernatorial nomination, Dan Cox, beat the candidate endorsed by the incumbent Republican governor, Larry Hogan. Michael Peroutka, hey, have you heard of that guy? A Confederacy-loving devotee of, quote, biblical law, won the nomination for AG. Back in the early 2010s, I used to occasionally cover Peroutka's monthly talks through his Institute on the Constitution in Severn, Maryland. Through the IOTC, Peroutka disseminates his, quote, American view of government and the law. And there are some screen grabs here that I guess illustrate his points. The, quote, American view of law and government says here, all courses and materials are developed using primary source documents and taught from the American view of law and government as defined by the Declaration of Independence. And here's a sampling of it. 1, there is a God. 2, our rights come from him. 3, the purpose of civil government is to secure and protect our God-given rights. Oh, well, then I imagine there are some stone tablets around that lay things out. But I can't find the primary source on that, so I guess we're out of luck. Interesting, though, that to call the Bible a primary source when it's been translated, retranslated, litigated to death over and over again over the years, New Testaments being added, Old Testaments being thrown out, various gospels being debated and just randomly excluded. You know, it's a little shaky. Plus, of course, being translated through 15 different languages and even in 5 different forms of English along the way. All right, but never mind. Sarah Posner has organized thoughts, and we might as well read those. This is a view common among Christian Reconstructionists and other proponents of biblical law, including that the role of government should be extremely limited, with their view of the Bible being the guiding force rather than man-made law, as they put it. Back when I attended Peroutka's events, guests included 10 Commandments Judge Roy Moore. Oh, yeah, he's a noted pervert. I forgot. Yeah, there's that guy. And Herb Titus, the law partner of William Olson, who has been in the news, as we discussed yesterday, after the New York Times reported on a memo that he wrote for Trump with plans to overturn the election and declare martial law. There's one connection for us. All right. But Titus is the key figure here. He is a Harvard-educated lawyer. It's amazing how they waste their time with these guys, who later turned to these Christian Reconstructionist / biblical law ideas. His brainchild back in the late 1970s and early 80s was to found a law school based on these principles. That law school was founded at Oral Roberts University and was named for W.O. Coburn, the late Senator Tom Coburn's father. I did not know that. After a protracted battle with the ABA over accreditation, it was eventually moved to Regent University and is where Dan Cox went to law school. We all know about Regent. Okay. Titus talked to me for a 2010 story that I wrote with Julie Ingersoll, linked herein, who is the real expert on Christian Reconstructionism. Read her book, it says. But Titus talked to me for 2010 story that she wrote together with Julie on guns, I guess. There's a word missing here, but I guess about guns and the gun issue. He told me about how Olson testified against Elena Kagan's SCOTUS nomination because of her opposition to gun rights. Titus was against the Kagan nomination and Titus was aghast that Kagan did not recognize these rights as God-given. There's another screen grab here, and I guess the quote from him at the time is, "Here's a woman who's being nominated to sit on the United States Supreme Court, and she's never thought about the question whether rights are given by God or given by men." Titus exclaimed incredulously, "She's never even considered it." Yeah, well, because she's a human. Anyway, in this view, Sarah continues, popular among Christian nationalists and militias, true patriots have a God-ordained duty to have guns. God says you got to have guns so that they can take up arms against a government they maintain has exceeded its authority given by God. Well, at least I guess it's internally logical. God does everything in this. God creates the government. God gives authority to the government. God gives you your rights. And one of the rights that God gives you is the right to kill the government he created because, I don't know. Oh, because it's exceeded the authority given by God. I see. So it's a Tower of Babel sort of thing, and you're supposed to shoot them down. By the way, note to self about God-given rights, or rather the theory that what gun rights are about is the necessity of allowing citizens to rise up in violent opposition to a government that they believe is tyrannical. Something that came up in a hearing the other day and widely circulated on the internet was video of Jamie Raskin yelling at Chip Roy from Texas about that very theory, which he calls the insurrectionist theory of the Second Amendment, about which I have some other interesting things perhaps to add. But let's continue with Sarah Posner's threaded exposition here. We had just read that, in this Christian nationalist or reconstructionist view, true patriots have a God-ordained duty to have guns so that they can take up arms against the government they maintain has exceeded its authority given by God. And there's another screen grab, I guess, describing this stuff. And, maybe we'll take the time to read through it. God and guns, the Christian duty to take up arms against the government. You know what? Maybe we won't. As a matter of fact, it seems a little... I'd love to know what the nuance of it is, but I guess it's dumb at heart, and we should just continue with Sarah Posner's reading through, although we're almost at the end of it. Then we can double back and read the excerpt she gave. In fact, the 10th and last, it looks like, piece in this thread reads that Larry Pratt, the head of the Olson law firm client Gun Owners of America, has advocated for state militias to take up arms against the federal government based on these concepts of biblical law. So, okay, now that's it. Let's double back and take a look at this God and guns, Christian duty to take up arms against the government. It reads, in part here, the part that's quoted, while many gun advocates are concerned with preserving access to firearms for hunting, and others argue that the right to possession of firearms is essential for self-defense against criminals, Reconstructionists have a loftier argument, therefore more important and more godly, I guess. So Christians can exercise their duty to take up arms against a government that has exceeded its bounds established by God.
Don't do that. All right, they did it. Shoot them.
I imagine God's voice, because God can't take care of it himself. You have to, with a gun. Because really, when you think about it, what options does God have to get rid of people? It's not like he's ever done that before, right? So, there was the rainbow, so now he's not supposed to do it wholesale. That's the promise. But it feels like, since everybody else, when they die, it was just their time. They were called home by God. Why doesn't God just call home tyrannical governments? And the answer is, I don't know, strange and mysterious. Kapow, I guess. That's it. Well, anyway, in this view, when the civil government oversteps the authority given to it by God, as determined by people who don't like other people, generally, citizens have a right and an obligation to resist. Sure, resist, yes. Titus insists it is the basis upon which this nation was founded. We were a well-armed people, and when the call came out, to come out and to fight the redcoats, people were armed, pastors and their parishioners. They came out and defended their liberties. There's more, but it looks like it cuts off the next paragraph, so I suppose we won't bother beginning with it. But that gives you a flavor of what they're talking about. The last tweet was the one about Larry Pratt, the head of Gun Owners of America, the big client of Olson's law firm, also talking about these concepts of biblical law. And it says this in an excerpt from where, I don't know. Pratt, whose advocacy has led him to intersect not only with the Tea Partiers, but also with neo-Nazis and white supremacists, what a nice intersection, sees the revitalization of the 10th Amendment movement. Far-right agitators who believe the federal government is largely unconstitutional as evidence of states pushing back federal authority. Pratt believes that states should be reactivating militias, which should be at their disposal instead of relying on the federal government to come and screw things up. These things should be given new life. I was distracted through that whole paragraph thinking about him making common cause with neo-Nazis. Given, again, these are the gun owners of America, and how frequently these people say, you gotta have guns to fight against the tyrannical government. After all, what was the first thing the Nazis did? They disarmed the people so that they could take over. Okay, so what are you, the gun-owning, gun-loving, anti-fascist people defending the country against tyrannical government doing, teaming up with the neo-Nazis, whose presumably it would be their first interest to disarm the people? And the answer is, well, they don't say it yet. So I guess that's it. Their current plans are to shoot all the Jews, and our plan is to make sure that we can sell them the guns to do it, I guess. That's the overlap. And then what about when they come for your guns so that they can take over? Well, we'll have been so nice to them and we'll have been in coalition with them. They'll surely keep us in the governing coalition and count us among the really good guys who are not eliminated, as opposed to them saying, well, those guys own all the guns. Why don't we kill them and take all their guns, and then we'll be the best armed people? Well, but they might have Aryan blood. Well, yes, but there's plenty of other Aryan blood around, too. And besides which, we can make better use of it the more guns we have. So why don't we kill those guys? I don't know what kind of name Pratt is, but it doesn't sound German. So, who knows? But he wouldn't be the first person to enter into an alliance on a mistaken basis. So, we'll give him that. Pratt refuses the label Christian Reconstructionist, by the way, telling RD, wherever RD is, it's wherever this is, I guess, coming from, this excerpt, that he prefers to identify, this is identity politics, I didn't realize this. He prefers to identify as a biblical Christian, not a Christian Reconstructionist, but a biblical Christian. He advocates for militias, which he describes as the sheriff's posse, and that the availability of it will further cool their jets, the federal government's jets. No more Wacos. It's been a while, okay? Because if you try something like that again, we're not going to stand around and watch. We're going to put you in our jail, which is what the sheriff in that county should have told the thugs in Waco and then gotten killed. This is predicated, Pratt insists, on the actual meaning of the word militia. You see, actually, militia means Larry Pratt's good friends, not anything else. But in his view, militia, as the word was put into the Constitution, you see, in the Bill of Rights, citing, of course, that great constitutional passage, Romans 13, Pratt said, the magistrate is a servant of God. He's supposed to be a terror to evildoers and a comfort to the righteous. So, we talk in terms of protecting people's liberties. That's really the same concept. I don't know if I'm convinced. I think you have more work to do on that one. In an essay posted on the GOA website, the Gun Owners of America, the piece, What Does the Bible Say About Gun Control? Pratt argues that resisting an attack is not to be confused with taking vengeance, which is the exclusive domain of God, citing Romans chapter 12, verse 19. That domain of God, he maintains, has been delegated to the civil magistrate, who is God's minister and avenger, to execute wrath on him who practices evil. But I maintain, of course, that this duty is non-delegable under the major questions doctrine, and I rule it unconstitutional, and therefore it's all over, and I think most of the current Supreme Court agrees with me on that one. Okay, so that's who we're talking about. These are the weirdos who are out there and, I don't know, threatening to screw up Maryland and, of course, the rest of the country if they are elected to office. So, again, the plea goes out, obviously. Don't listen to anybody, especially a Republican operative telling you that they have no chance in hell. Make sure that they have no chance in hell. Make sure that the only place they end up, for that matter, is hell, and that they have no chance when they get there. Come out, vote, don't fool around with it. And if you ever have any inkling of screwing around in a Republican primary, think twice. Sometimes it might, I don't know, I guess at some point you might convince me that it makes sense, but it wasn't necessary here. And I would much rather that all the blame for nominating these idiots lay at the feet of Republicans and Republicans only, although they would just lie and say Democrats did it that then too. So maybe there's no way out of it. Now, as for what I had mentioned about Jamie Raskin unloading on Chip Roy in what was probably a Judiciary Committee hearing of some point. I think it's a rather lengthy video to play in its entirety, but it is probably public domain because it happened in Congress, and so maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea to play through it and then to add a particular comment to it, to expand on his thoughts here. So let's rig it up with the computers here, and I'll play you that excerpt. There's no context in the tweet that I got from this, although I got it from Paul Waldman, who Greg's not here today to say that he's of no relation, but it is true that he's not, I think. No one ever told me what it was. Anyway, this, I think, was pretty interesting. Good reminder, he says, that the people who most loudly proclaim their love of the Constitution are the same ones who say, I need all these guns in case I decide to have to start killing cops, soldiers, and public officials. And I think it's funny in that they will say, yes, I do think that. That's exactly right. I totally admit to that, and I'm not ashamed about it because that's my theory of the Second Amendment, that it was put in there by the founders who knew that we might one day have to stand up to a tyrannical government and overthrow it. And I guess that's something that might make you love the Constitution. But yeah, it's awfully hard to reconcile. I mean, it's just a difficult situation. All of the public officials that you would then claim to hate, and I mean, we don't even get around to actually evaluating your claims. Like, maybe you're completely wrong in your hatred of these cops, soldiers, public officials, etc. There is room for that, and they never acknowledge that. Like, what if you're just wrong? But I want to talk about that in a minute. But, I mean, they're all, generally speaking, empowered or, endowed with the powers of their office by the Constitution. I love part of the Constitution, just not most of the Constitution. And so that's a little silly. But okay, this is a real interesting exposition of it by Jamie Raskin. I think I've got the volume all the way up here. So it's about almost 2 minutes, 2 full minutes. I don't know whether I'm going to have to stop and comment or not, but I think we're probably okay. If YouTube comes after us, they're mistaken because this can't be copyrighted, even though it might be being played on network news and they might be claiming it's theirs. It's government footage. So screw you, YouTube, if you think you're going to mess this up. Although they're not listening. It's an algorithm. They're going to screw it up just, automatically, and nobody's going to listen to me. So maybe you'll never get to hear this episode. I don't know.
Who's an able-bodied person. I'm not going to yield, but I'm coming to you right now. My friend from Texas, Mr. Roy, advances the so-called insurrectionist view of the Second Amendment, that the Second Amendment's purpose is to give the people the right to overthrow or fight our government or fight the police or threaten armed resistance if the government is somehow being unfair or unjust. This reading is totally, absolutely absurd and flies in the face of the plain text of the Constitution, which in at least 5 different places clearly forbids armed, violent resistance to the government.
And very interesting. A great start, by the way. And he's right. I don't know if he's right about the number, but yes, I know that probably took a lot of people by surprise who are, even if they're not full-fledged insurrectionist theory of the Second Amendment supporters, are people who acknowledge that, well, there were some founders who probably did think that was the case. And so it's not all that easy to dismiss out of hand, but he just goes ahead and does it anyway. But he begins to make a good point here. There's all sorts of language all over the Constitution, both the original Constitution and amendments added since the Civil War when people actually tried to do this. But there's all sorts of language all over the Constitution that, let's say, very strongly discourages violent revolution against the government, and he begins to explain them here.
The Republican Guarantee Clause in Article 4, Section 4 provides that the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion and on application of the legislature or the executive against domestic violence.
Now, I'll stop him again here. I anticipate that, by the way, that one day one of these people will say exactly Article 4, which is very, rarely cited these days, but Article 4 guarantees everyone a Republican form of government, and that means that we can use our arms to kill the rest of you unless a Republican runs this state. That's, of course, not what it means, but remember that these are the people who say, well, duh, Nazis are leftists because National Socialists, right? See, but this is who you're dealing with. I joke about that, but it's only I'm only kidding a little bit, because I do think one day they will make this mistake / take this opportunity. And I don't know, you will have heard it here, I don't know, probably second or third, I would think. Anyway, there's more.
This was put in the Constitution specifically in response to Shays' rebellion and armed resistance to the government of the United States, which the founders strongly opposed. Here's another provision the gentleman from Texas should consider before cavalierly suggesting in public that citizens somehow have a constitutional right to use arms against our government and our police. Article 3, Section 3, Clause 1 states, in the only constitutional passage that defines a crime, treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them.
Aha, that is very interesting. I'll bring that up again in a second. And by the way, remarkable, very quick read here, and remarkable restraint by Chip Roy. I'm quite impressed by the fact that he doesn't try to butt in and scream at Raskin during this. He's actually, quite restrained and all of that. But let's keep rolling. I like that. Remember that one of the 5 passages that specifically says you can't use violence against the United States is that they define treason, and they do so in the Constitution. They define it as only as levying war against the United States, or I suppose giving aid and comfort to those who are levying war against the United States. And certainly armed resistance, what else could you call it but levying war against the United States? The fact that that's the one and only crime listed and defined in the Constitution is pretty clear evidence you're not supposed to be doing this. But again, it leaves some questions I'll get to in a minute. More Jamie Raskin.
Or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. Armed insurrection and violence against the United States is plainly making war against our government, and thus is an act of treason. And I could cite all of the other ones. And what do they have against this? A quote from Patrick Henry, an anti-federalist who opposed the Constitution precisely because he thought it gave too much power to the federal government and didn't endow the people with a right of violent resistance against the government of the United States. That's not constitutional law. That's a constitutional joke. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, that's pretty good. There's just a little bit of interplay, 5 seconds of Jerry Nadler saying, oh, okay, I'll recognize somebody else now. So that's about the end of the tape. Great points, I thought, generally speaking. And, I had something to add to that, which is, one, I love the terminology, the insurrectionist theory of the Second Amendment. Raskin, towards the end there, I probably should have stopped it again, points out that, armed insurrection against the United States can't really be interpreted as anything but treason. And golly, if Raskin isn't on the committee dealing with the insurrection of January 6th, which, as it turns out, was an armed insurrection, not as armed as they had wanted it to be, that's true. And you might call into question exactly how serious they were at the time, given that they didn't bring most of the weapons available to them with them. But it was a good point that the insurrection really can't be viewed as much other than treason, and yet they're not leveling that charge just yet, and I understand why. But what that brought to mind for me is, if the insurrectionist theory of the Second Amendment is correct, like if we indulge Chip Roy for just a second and say, yes, the purpose of the Second Amendment is chiefly to allow people to accumulate and hold enough arms for the purpose such that they can take up arms against the government and overthrow even a very powerful central government once it becomes too tyrannical, to preserve your liberty, of course. But on whose authority and who says when it's time to go and when something is just fake. I mean, Republicans are constantly saying that Democratic presidents are tyrannical and are dictatorial. I mean, they said it about Obama. They said it about Clinton. They say it now about Biden. They've said it forever. And it's like a running joke with these guys. So, you never know when one of them, like now that we're dealing with the consequences, finally, at long last, dealing with the consequences of the listeners to this Republican rhetoric actually acting on this stuff. And lo and behold, the way that it manifests itself is in exactly that. Treason, levying war against the United States. I mean, Republicans have been saying for a long time that all Democrats are tyrants and dictators, and that they finally took up arms against them. I don't know where you think you're supposed to point the blame here, but I'll tell you, at Republicans who say this stuff. Anyway, so indulging the theory just for a second and saying, okay, Chip Roy, what if it were true that the purpose of the Second Amendment was really the insurrectionist theory, that people had to have guns and they had to have them in such numbers and of such power such that they posed a real threat to overthrowing the government should it grow to become too tyrannical? Well then, as Raskin points out, the definition of treason, it is here in the Constitution, and says levying war against the United States is treason. Now, the only way then to figure out, under the insurrectionist theory of the Second Amendment, to figure out the difference between treason and a, I guess, so-called proper exercise of the Second Amendment against the government, right? Well, they're totally tyrannical. Well, who says so? Well, Chip Roy says so. Why? Because they said that I couldn't have benzene-flavored ice cream. Well, why did they say that? It's my liberty if I want to poison myself with benzene in the ice cream. Well, there's a regulation that says you can't put poison in the ice cream. It's bad for kids. And, well, it's my choice, and I don't have to sell it to kids. And I think liberty, whatever it is, they always come up with something. That's tyrannical. My car should get 20 miles to the gallon, or else they can't sell it to me. Tyrannical. Whatever it is. School lunches should be only $1. Tyrannical. We should wear masks. Tyrannical. We should pay taxes. Tyrannical. All these things. So how do you tell the difference between a traitor and a real true patriot when they start shooting people? And the answer has to be, the only answer there could possibly be is you got to look at who wins and who loses. A traitor is someone who believes the federal government has grown too tyrannical, takes up arms against it, and loses. A patriot, I guess, is someone who takes up arms against the federal government when it grows too tyrannical and wins, and then thereby throws out the established constitutional order and installs himself instead, or his choice of government instead. It may or may not be constitutionally based. They might think they're adopting the same constitution, just a different interpretation. They might start it all over again. I guess it doesn't matter. If they overthrow the government, they can declare the Constitution suspended and replace it with their own. And even if it's replacing the Constitution word for word, they can just say, yes, but we don't understand this to be treason, and we're the ones now holding the gavel, and so you're the ones levying war against us. Of course, we started the war and you fought back, but that's still levying war against the people who won. You're the traitors. But that's the way it works. Now, if your theory then, Chip Roy, is correct, like I said, the only way to tell the difference between treason and patriotism is who wins and who loses. And the bottom line is, as Jamie Raskin pointed out, January 6th was an armed insurrection against the United States. It's treason. January 6th insurrectionists lost. Imposed the penalty. That's the stage we're at. I'm sorry, you lost your insurrection. You're traitors now. The penalty, is up to and including death. The penalty is death. You should be executed for your insurrection. This was not my idea. This was Chip Roy's idea. He said the Second Amendment was all about enabling insurrection. I say the punishment for treason is all about what to do with the people whom you defeat in their insurrection. I didn't write the rules. You're the one that said you love the Constitution. The Constitution, and maybe even the Bible, Larry, say you should die for this. So, what am I going to do? My hands are tied. The big guy says you got to die. So, I don't know. I'm not sure how convinced I am of the insurrectionist theory of the Second Amendment. I'm just saying that if you're convinced of it, then maybe you got to die. Not because you're convinced of it, but because you participated in an insurrection. Now, Chip Roy might save his life because, as I recall, he wasn't entirely convinced by this whole insurrection thing after all. The one that developed. He might have supported a different insurrection, but the January 6th insurrection, I think he and Mike Lee jumped out at maybe the last plausible second to depart from the insurrection and still save your life. But a lot of your buddies are going to have to go. And maybe Chip Roy wouldn't even disagree. I don't know. I just thought it should be pointed out. And, as shocking as that might be, I will say, and I did tweet about this yesterday, it's not something new or weird or that I'm inventing here. It's not anything radical or extraordinary. It is a perfectly plain, common sense understanding of what's going on here. It is as pick your slice of culture you want to deal with here. Do you want to do the Ralph Waldo Emerson route and put it, when you strike at a king, you must kill him, right? If you're going to take up arms in insurrection against the United States and you lose, you're a traitor. You win, you're a patriot. You're the new government, as a matter of fact, if you win. When you strike at a king, you must kill him. Or maybe you prefer the version from The Wire, when Omar's character says, you come at the king, you best not miss, right? Well, you came and you lost. So now the consequences of treason are upon you. And so, okay, I just thought, maybe you wanted to have a chance to reevaluate whether or not that was a theory you wanted to support. And I also would add, as I did yesterday, by the way, the insurrectionist theory of the Second Amendment reminds me a lot of the problem we have with the open carriers and people who, particularly the AR-15 open carriers, and they're walking around and we can't tell whether that guy, is that a see something, say something situation? Should I report him? Is he a mass shooter? I don't know. Or when the cops approach, is he going to say, I'm just exercising my rights. I have every right to do this, to scare that living crap out of everybody and have the police called out on me. It's my Second Amendment right, even up to and including shooting you because I think you're such a tyrant. Probably shouldn't say that, but whatever. Maybe you'd be able to get away with it. So anyway, the same situation that we always worry about. We don't know whether this guy is a crazed mass shooter on his way to start a mass shooting or whether he's just exercising his rights and has no intention of that at all. And the suicide pact of the Second Amendment has left us with only one option. You got to wait until he starts killing. And even then, you got to figure out who he's killing because of the story we heard yesterday from down in Texas, where, suppose you just start stepping into the road and firing your weapon at a passing pickup truck. Everybody would think you're a mass shooter starting on your rampage, but you think you're shooting at the guy who might have been the one that robbed you at the ATM a few minutes ago. You're pretty sure you're right, though. Even if you're not right that he's a tyrant, he's just one guy, and he's not trying to overthrow the government or whatever, but you were pretty sure that was the guy, so you're going to start shooting. Everybody else sees crazed shooter, and so maybe even after you start shooting, you can't really tell whether or not it's right to take a shot at you. But, these are the impossible situations that line up once you accept these stupid ideas. And this is the best indication that these guys have misinterpreted the Second Amendment, no matter how they've done it, whether it's about the insurrectionist theory of the Second Amendment or it's the everybody is able to go about armed and everybody ought to be able to shoot at everybody as long as they're willing to say that they thought their life was in danger. Everybody can shoot at everybody unless reasons come up and you can't. And after the fact, they tell you were wrong about that. it's a pretty good indication that your interpretation of the amendment is wrong, because it leads to no law whatsoever. We can't tell what's going on. We can't predict the state of the law. We don't know who's a good guy. We don't know who's a bad guy. We don't know how to tell who's a good guy, who's a bad guy. We can't even tell after the shooting starts who's a good guy and who's a bad guy. This might be a terrible theory for a constitutional amendment. You might be just in outer space here, Chip, and maybe you ought to think about it. All right, well, what did I tell you? All right, so what do you say? It's been about an hour, and we did it without commercials, and we kind of kept the theme here. And although I have many other stories to share with you, it's getting kind of late. Remember, it's fake Thursday morning. It's actually Wednesday evening. I've already done the show. I got lots to do tomorrow. Why don't I just leave it at that? We'll keep you company with an interesting discussion ranging all over the right-wing schools of thought these days. Probably pretty good setup for what's going to go on tonight. Hopefully it carries you into tonight's hearing with a more rounded sense of exactly what's at stake and who the players are and just how crazy they're thinking of getting, how freaky they're thinking of getting with our government and our Constitution, should they get their hands on it. At any rate, why don't we all stay tuned? I don't know whether he's going to follow me up right away, Justice Putnam, with the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, since it's only going to be about 10 a.m. Eastern Time, or whether he'll fill in with something else. But I can assure you that if you do stick around until 11 o'clock, you will have heard the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy in all of its eclectic glory. We'll be back live tomorrow to discuss what went on at the hearings. So one more crack at it Friday, plus maybe some Friday esoterica of our own.
From networksradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
You got to think of a new word for esoteric so that I can really fill these things out. All right, well, thanks again for joining us. Hopefully you had a good time with the 1 hour I was able to offer you. Just something new and fun. Keep you up to date and not lose your place in the progression of these hearings. We'll see you again tomorrow.